You wake up before the others. The fire has burned down to a red pulse in the middle of the shelter, and you can feel the cold pressing at your back. You open your eyes. Nothing changes. For a second, you think you're still asleep. You blink hard. You turn your head toward the mouth of the cave, where the gray morning light should be spilling in across the floor. It isn't there. There's a smear of pale nothing where the world used to be. You sit up too fast. Your hand goes out and finds a sleeping mat, then a bone, then a body. Someone grunts. You want to say something, but your mouth won't make the shape of it yet, because saying it out loud would make it real. You are 30 years old. You have been the one who spots the herd first. You have been the one who reads a track in wet sand and tells the others how long ago it was made and how heavy the animal was. Your eyes were the reason people wanted you on the hunt. And now they're gone. Somewhere outside, the group is already stirring. In a few hours, they'll walk. And you know exactly what everyone in that shelter is quietly working out right now, even the ones who love you. What do we do with him? Here's what almost everyone assumes happened next. They assume you got left. A little food, a little water, a spot near the wall, and then the sound of footsteps thinning out until there was nothing but wind. It's the story we tell about the ancient world. Life was brutal, so the weak were dropped. Then scientists started opening old graves and reading old bones, and the story fell apart. Because the skeletons they keep finding aren't the skeletons of people who were abandoned. They're the skeletons of people who lived for years after they should have been dead. People who couldn't feed themselves. People who couldn't walk. People whose bodies show that someone else was carrying the weight of keeping them alive, day after day, for a very long time. So the question isn't whether ancient humans left the blind behind. It's how on earth they didn't. Start with the thing nobody expects, because it explains how common this was. Most ancient people didn't go blind in a single dramatic moment. They went blind slowly, in their own homes, from the one thing that kept them alive. Fire. Picture the inside of a rock shelter at night. A hearth in the middle, damp wood, green branches, animal fat dripping and flaring. There's no chimney. The smoke rises, hits the low ceiling, and rolls back down over everyone sleeping under it. You breathe it. You sleep in it. You spend every winter night of your life with your face in it. Smoke is a slow knife for eyes. It dries out the surface, irritates the lids, and turns a small infection into a permanent one. Sit in it for 30 years, and the front of the eye starts to scar, thicken, and cloud. The scarring doesn't hurt much at first. It just quietly takes detail away. That's the part that gets under your skin. The blindness didn't come from a predator or a fall or an enemy. It came from the warm circle everyone crowded into because outside was worse. So if the fire that saved you was also blinding you, what did that leave you with by the time you were old? It left you with a white ring growing. Anyone who lived long enough in the ancient world had a good chance of watching their own sight fog over. The lens inside the eye stiffens and clouds with age, and sunlight speeds it up. Ancient humans spent their entire lives outdoors, on open plains, on water, on snow, under a sun nobody could hide from. The way it arrives is cruel because it's gentle. First, colors go flat. Faces you've known your whole life start to blur at the edges, so you learn to recognize people by how they walk. Then, the blur creeps inward from the sides. Bright light stops helping and starts hurting, and midday becomes a wall of white glare you can't see through at all. And nobody could tell you how long you'd have. Some people held on to a smear of light at the edge for years. Others woke up one morning with even that gone. Eventually, the pupil, which should look like a black well, goes pale. Anyone can look at your face and see it. There's a milky disc sitting where the darkness used to be. People had ways of checking, too. Someone waves a hand across your face and watches whether you flinch. Someone lifts a burning brand and moves it slowly from side to side and asks if you can follow it. If your eyes drift and don't track the flame, everyone standing there has their answer, and so do you. And here's the strange part. That milky disc was visible from the outside, which means the people around you knew what was happening long before you admitted it. They watched it grow. They had a word for it. They had seen it in their own parents. So a group that had watched this happen again and again wasn't caught off guard. They'd had time to think about it. The real question is what they decided to do. Before we get there, there's a faster kind of blindness, and it could take you in a single afternoon. Say you're crossing open snow, or moving along a frozen river, or paddling a stretch of bright water. The light bounces up off the surface into your face for hours. You feel nothing while it's happening. That's the trap. 6 to 12 hours later, your eyes start to feel like they're full of sand. They water and clamp shut. Any light at all is agony. The surface of the eye has been burned, and now you're blind, curled up with your face in your hands, for a day or two. It heals, that's the good news. The bad news is where it usually happened. It happened out on the ice, far from shelter, in the exact conditions where being unable to see for 2 days kills you. So ancient hunters in the far north did something clever. They carved goggles out of driftwood, bone, and antler, shaped them to the face, and cut a narrow slit across each eye. Almost no light gets through a slit that thin. Others smeared dark pigment or charcoal under their eyes to kill the glare coming up off the snow. Think about what that means. Long before anyone understood light, people had worked out that sight was something you had to actively defend. They were wearing protection. Which raises an uncomfortable thought. If they were guarding their eyes that carefully, they must have known exactly what life looked like for the ones who lost them. Not all of it was slow. Some of it took a heartbeat. You're sitting with a core of flint between your knees, striking flakes off the edge. It's the most ordinary job in the ancient world, and every strike throws off slivers of stone with edges sharper than surgical steel. Most of them fall in your lap. One of them doesn't. There's no pain at first. There's a click, a wetness, and the sudden certainty that something is very wrong with the left side of your face. That's one way. There were plenty of others. A spark from wet wood popping out of the fire, a branch whipping back on a trail, a horn, a hoof, a fist in a fight over meat, a spear that missed. In a world where every tool was an edge and every animal was armed, eyes were the softest thing anyone owned. What happened in the next hour decided everything. Wash it with clean water, keep the hands off it, bind it, sit the person in the dark and make them stay there. And a shallow wound could heal over with only a scar in the way. Let it get dirty and the infection walks straight to the back of the eye. And then it doesn't stop at one eye. It can take the other one with it. And sometimes it takes the person. So they had reasons to be careful. But even the most careful group couldn't do anything about the thing that was blinding whole villages at once. If you're enjoying uncovering these forgotten truths about ancient humans, hit subscribe now because the next discovery is the one that changed what scientists believed about how our ancestors treated their own. There was another kind of blindness that came and went with the seasons, and it terrified people because it arrived at dusk. You could see perfectly all day. Then the sun would drop, and while everyone else adjusted to the dim, you'd be stranded. You couldn't find the path. You couldn't find the fire. You'd stand there in the blue hour with your hands out like a child. This was night blindness, and it came from hunger. Not the empty belly kind, the hidden kind, where you're eating enough to live, but missing something your eyes need to rebuild themselves after dark. In lean seasons, on a diet of roots and grain and almost no fat, it spread through whole camps at once. And ancient people cured it without knowing why. Egyptian healers wrote down a treatment for the person who couldn't see at nightfall. Take liver, roast it, and give it to the patient. Some versions press the juices onto the eyes themselves. It sounds like superstition. It isn't. Liver is one of the richest sources on the planet of exactly the substance those eyes were starving for. Feed it to someone with night blindness and their sight comes back. Other groups fed the sufferer fish oil or eggs or the fatty organs of seals and caribou and got the same result. Nobody could explain it. They just knew the animal carried the cure inside it. So we know they were treating blindness, which makes the next discovery even harder to explain, because it shows that in some places, blindness wasn't getting rarer. It was exploding. The thing that blinded more ancient humans than any predator, any accident, and any fight wasn't out in the wild at all. It was the village. When people stopped moving and settled down beside their fields, they built something new: crowds. Families packed into mud-walled rooms, animals penned a few steps from the doorway, waste piling up where it had never piled up before, water sitting in ditches, and flies, in numbers no wandering camp had ever produced. That's the perfect delivery system for an eye infection that spreads from face to face, on fingers, on shared cloth, on the legs of flies that land on a child's eyelids to drink. The first infection isn't much. Redness, itching, crusting, it clears. Then you catch it again, because everyone around you has it. And again, and again. Each round leaves a little scar tissue inside the upper lid. Over the years, those scars tighten and pull the lid inward until the eyelashes are turned around and dragging across the surface of the eye with every single blink. That's when it becomes a horror. Your own lashes scratch the eye thousands of times a day. The surface clouds over. You go blind, slowly, from the inside of your own eyelid. Mummies from ancient Egypt still carry the marks of it, and Egyptian medical texts are stuffed with recipes for sore, weeping, sticky eyes. Whole professions grew up around it. Some of the earliest specialist doctors we know of were eye doctors, because they had that much work. Settling down gave people bread, walls, and stored grain. It also gave them a blindness epidemic. So what happened to all those people once the light went out? There's one more, and it's the strangest of them all, because it explains why some ancient people walked away from the best land they had. Along fast-running rivers in parts of Africa, there lives a small biting fly that breeds in white water. It bites, and it leaves behind something that grows inside a person for years. Thread-like worms spread under the skin. The itching is unbearable, bad enough that people scratch themselves raw and can't sleep. And in the end, the damage reaches the eyes and the sight goes. Now think about what that does to a group's decisions. The riverbank is the richest place in the landscape. Water, fish, game coming down to drink, reeds, shade, everything you want. And on certain stretches of certain rivers, the families who settled there kept going blind, one after another, the older ones first, until the strongest people in the group were leading the ones who couldn't see. They wouldn't have known about the fly or the worm. They only knew the pattern. Live too close to the loud water, and eventually you can't see. So people pulled back. They kept the river for what they had to take from it and slept further out. That's a whole community reorganizing itself around a blindness nobody could explain, which brings us to the moment that matters. Once the sight was gone, and it stayed gone, what actually happened to that person? For that, you have to go much further back, to a cave in the mountains where a man died around 45,000 years ago. When his skeleton came out of the ground, it was a mess of old injuries. A crushing blow had landed on the left side of his face and collapsed the bone around his eye socket. He almost certainly lost the sight in that eye. His right arm was withered and useless from the elbow down, an old injury that had wasted the whole limb. There was damage that would have made him partly deaf. His legs showed arthritis and a healed break. He limped badly. Now here's the part that stops you. Every single one of those injuries had healed. He didn't die from the blow to his face. He lived on with it for years, with one eye, one working arm, bad hearing, and a bad leg, in a world where being slow was fatal. A man in that condition doesn't chase animals. He can't defend himself. He can't outrun anything that wants to eat him. Somebody fed him. Somebody kept him warm. Somebody made a place for him inside the group and kept it there while his body fell apart. And these were Neanderthals, the people we spent a century calling brutes. But one eye isn't two. He still had light. So the harder question remained wide open. What happened to someone who had none at all? The graves have an answer, and it's the same answer over and over, from opposite ends of the ancient world. In a cave in southern Italy, a young man was buried who had a form of dwarfism so severe he couldn't have hunted, couldn't have carried a load, and couldn't have kept up on a march. He lived to be a teenager anyway, in an ice age, in a group that lived by moving. Then they buried him carefully, in an embrace with an older woman. In a village in Southeast Asia, another skeleton came up that shouldn't exist. The man's spine was fused. His arms barely worked. He'd been paralyzed from the waist down since he was a boy. He lived about 10 more years in that condition. 10 years of someone lifting him, turning him, feeding him, cleaning him, keeping his skin from breaking down, in a farming village with no spare hands and no spare food. In a waterlogged burial ground in Florida, bodies came out with old, healed conditions that would have made ordinary life impossible, and they'd survived them for years. None of these people could pay their own way. All of them lived a long time. That's not one kind group getting lucky. That's a pattern. And once you accept that ancient humans were willing to keep people alive who couldn't produce, the blindness question flips completely. It stops being, would they help you? It becomes, how did you actually live, hour by hour, once the world went dark? The first thing you'd lose isn't food or safety. It's the ground. A camp looks like chaos to a stranger. To someone who's lived in it, it's a map. 30 paces from the sleeping area to the fire, the slope of the floor rising slightly toward the back wall, the dry crunch of the midden where the shells and bones go, the way the wind comes in from the left in the morning and swings around by evening. If you lose your sight in a place you know, you don't lose the map. You already carry it. You walk it with your feet and your memory instead of your eyes. That's why ancient camps did something that seems tiny and is actually everything. They kept things where they were. The woodpile stays in the same corner. The water gourds hang from the same branch. Nobody moves the sleeping mats. A blind person in a stable camp can move around all day without asking for help, as long as nothing shifts. Then there are the anchors. The fire is the loudest, warmest, smokiest thing in your world, so it's your compass. Running water gives you a wall of sound to walk along. A trail worn smooth by feet feels completely different underfoot from untouched ground. A stick held out in front turns into a second set of fingers reading the path a step ahead of you. Within a few weeks, you'd be moving around your own camp without help, which sounds like the problem is solved. It isn't, because a person who can move around camp is still a person who eats. And in the ancient world, eating without producing was the fastest way to lose your place. So you'd have to become useful again. And here's the thing almost nobody realizes about ancient work. Most of it wasn't done with the eyes. Think about what a group actually needs every single day. It needs rope. And rope is made by rolling plant fiber against your thigh and twisting it together. A motion your hands learn so completely that you can do it in the dark. It needs hides softened, which is hours of scraping and working the skin between your fists until it's supple. It needs cordage for nets and snares and bindings, and every one of those knots is a shape your fingers already know. It needs the fire kept, which is a job of listening and feeling, not looking. It needs nuts cracked, shellfish opened, roots peeled, grain ground on a stone, meat cut into strips and hung to dry. It needs baskets woven. It needs skins stitched with a bone awl where your fingertip finds the hole before the point does. A blind person can do all of that. Slowly at first, then not slowly at all. And this is the calculation that decided your fate. If you can make the rope that holds the shelter together and the cord that sets the snares, you're not a mouth, you're a producer. The group doesn't have to make a moral choice about keeping you because you're already paying. But rope and baskets keep you fed. They don't make you important. And there was one job where losing your sight didn't hold you back at all. It made you the best person in camp. There's a version of this we've skipped, and it's the one that would have hurt the most. A child. A baby born without sight. Or a small child whose eyes clouded over after a fever. No memory of faces, no stored map of the camp, no years of skill already banked in the hands. Just a child in a world with no soft edges. By every cold calculation, this is the one that shouldn't survive. And yet, the growing up would have been the easiest part to solve, because children learn a place with their whole body anyway. Crawling teaches the floor. Bare feet learn every root and stone on the path to the water. A voice calling across camp is a direction. By 6 or 7, that child knows the ground better than a sighted adult who wandered in from another group. And the work starts early. Small hands are good at fiber. Rolling cord, stripping bark, picking grit out of grain, feeding a fire twig by twig. A blind child in a busy camp isn't sitting still being pitied. They're being handed tasks because everyone is handed tasks. What that child couldn't be given was the future everyone else got. No hunting party, no long journeys alone, a much harder path to a partner and children of their own. The group could keep them fed and safe and busy and still not be able to give them a full life. So the blind survived. But surviving isn't the same as belonging, and that raises the question the graves can't answer for us on their own. Night. When the fire burns low and the dark comes down over the camp, everyone else goes helpless. Their eyes are useless out past the firelight. They lie there listening, and they aren't good at it, because they've spent their whole lives letting their eyes do the work. You've spent months doing nothing but listening. You know the difference between wind moving through dry grass and something moving through dry grass. You can hear a heavy animal shifting its weight 200 paces out. You know which direction the river sound is coming from, which tells you which way the air is moving, which tells you whether whatever is out there has already smelled the camp. You hear a child's breathing change before it wakes. That's not a sad consolation. That's a sentinel. In a world where the most dangerous hours are the ones between dusk and dawn, the person who hears best is the person who saves everyone. And the blind man by the fire is the one still awake and still listening while the rest sleep. There's something else the dark gives you: time to talk. And talking in the ancient world was not small. Everything a group knew was carried in someone's head. There were no written maps, no stored records, no way to look anything up. The location of a spring that only runs in dry years, the season a certain fruit ripens, which plant stops bleeding and which one stops a heart, the route through the hills your grandfather's people used, who is related to whom, and therefore who can marry whom. All of it lived in memory, and it moved by voice from one person to the next, or it died. Now think about who's best placed to hold that. Someone who can't hunt has time. Someone who can't scan the horizon spends their attention on words instead. Someone whose sight faded late in life learned every one of those routes and rules while they could still see, and then spent years with nothing to do but rehearse them. Blindness turns a person into a library. And the ancient world seems to have understood this, because when you look at who held knowledge and song in early societies, blind people keep showing up in the role. Egyptian tomb walls are painted with blind harpists performing for the household. The oldest storytelling traditions we have are tied to a blind singer who supposedly held tens of thousands of lines in his head. The singer who can't see is a figure that appears again and again in place after place, far too often to be coincidence. So the blind weren't dead weight. Some of them were the most valuable person in the camp. But all of this only works while the camp stays put. And ancient life did not stay put. This is the real danger, not the dark, the move. Every group followed the food, and following the food meant packing up and walking, down to the river in the dry months, up into the hills when the herds came through, across country to reach the coast or the flint or the winter shelter before the weather closed in. Now put yourself in it. The camp map you spent months memorizing is gone the moment you leave it. You're walking on ground you've never touched, at the pace of people who can see, carrying nothing, with your hand on someone's shoulder or a cord tied between you and the person ahead. Every stream crossing is a guess. Every slope is a guess. You slow the whole line down, and the line can't afford to slow down. There's a window when the river is low enough to cross, and a window before the snow, and a window while the herd is still passing. Miss it, and people starve. That's the moment the group's kindness collides with its survival. And that's where a blind person actually died. Not abandoned in some cold-blooded ritual, but lost on a move, falling behind on a night march, going into a river crossing and not coming out, which forces the ugliest question in this whole story. When the move was too hard, did they always take you with them? Honestly, no. The graves that show us long-term care are real, but they're not the whole record, and it would be a lie to pretend otherwise. Those burials survive partly because they're the exceptions people took the trouble to bury with care. There were other years when the rains failed and the group was already starving before anyone got sick. Years when a hard winter meant every calorie handed to someone who couldn't hunt was a calorie taken out of a child. Groups facing that don't hold votes. They just move a little faster and a little further, and someone doesn't keep up. Some of the harshest stories that survive from ancient peoples are about exactly this. The old and the failing, left at a camp with food and fire when the group had to go and the person couldn't. Sometimes the person chose it because they knew what staying together would cost everyone else. So both things are true. Ancient humans carried their blind and their broken through years of hardship far more often than we ever gave them credit for. And when the margin ran out, they lost them. Which explains why some people got desperate enough to try the unthinkable, cutting into the eye itself. There was one form of blindness that looked like it could be fixed, because you could see the problem sitting right there behind the pupil, that milky disc. And in the ancient world, someone worked out that if you pushed it out of the way, light could get back in. The procedure was brutal in its simplicity. A sharp instrument, a needle or a fine blade, is pushed through the white of the eye just beside the colored ring. The tip is worked behind the clouded lens, and then the lens is pressed down and back, out of the line of sight, and left sitting at the bottom of the eye. The pupil goes black again. Light floods a retina that hasn't seen properly in years. Ancient Indian medical texts describe it in careful detail, right down to holding the patient still, warming the eye first, the angle of the needle, and the moment the patient reports light returning. Then the eye is bandaged, and the patient is told to lie still and avoid coughing and sneezing. The bandage stayed on for days, and the patient was fed by someone else the whole time, flat on their back in the dark, waiting to find out which way it had gone. Older still, the law code of Babylon fixes the fees for a surgeon who opens a man's eye socket with a bronze lancet. It also fixes the punishment for failure, and the punishment is savage. That law tells you two things at once. Eye surgery was common enough to need a price, and it went wrong often enough to need a penalty. Because it did go wrong. Push that needle wrong and you cause bleeding, infection, or a detached retina, and the eye is gone for good. Even when it worked, the person could see shapes and light, not detail, because the lens that focused everything was now lying in the bottom of the eye. Half your sight back is still a miracle when the alternative is nothing. And that's the clue to what ancient humans really did about blindness, because most of their answers weren't cures at all. They were defenses. Look at what they were smearing on their faces. Ancient Egyptians painted thick, dark lines around their eyes, and we file it under fashion. It wasn't only fashion. The dark band cuts the desert glare coming off the sand, the same trick the ice hunters were using with charcoal and slit goggles at the other end of the world. And the paste itself, ground from lead-based minerals, appears to have interfered with the bacteria that caused the eye infections everyone around them was going blind from. It goes further. Their medical texts list honey in eye remedies, and honey genuinely kills bacteria. They washed weeping eyes and cleaned crusted lids in a place where flies carried infection from face to face. They wrote out remedies for the pupil that had gone pale, for eyes that watered, for eyes that itched, for the person who couldn't see at nightfall. That is not a people who shrugged at blindness. That's a people at war with it. And when they lost the war, which was often, the answer was never a single act of mercy or cruelty. It was a system. Keep the camp unchanged so the blind can walk it. Give them the work that lives in the hands. Give them the night watch. Give them the stories to hold. Feed them while they hold them. So, what did ancient humans actually do when someone went blind? They did the one thing that no other animal on Earth does. Every other species is ruthless here. An animal that can't see, can't feed, can't flee, and doesn't last the season. Sight is life, and losing it ends the argument. Humans broke that rule, not with medicine and not with pity. They broke it because of how they had already built their groups. Their food was shared, so a person who couldn't hunt could still eat. Their knowledge lived in speech, so a person who couldn't see could still teach. Their work lived in the hands, so a person in the dark could still produce. Their camps stayed still long enough to be memorized, so a person without eyes could still walk through their own life. Every one of those things existed before anybody went blind. They just turned out to be the exact things that made blindness survivable. That's why a man with a caved-in face and one working arm lived for years in an Ice Age cave. That's why a paralyzed boy in a farming village lived a decade after his body quit. Those aren't stories about disability. They're the clearest evidence we have that our ancestors had already decided a person is worth more than what they can carry. And that decision is the thing we inherited. Not their fire, not their flint, this. Because a group that keeps its blind alive keeps its memory alive. And a group that keeps its memory alive keeps everything else. If they'd made the other choice, the knowledge would have died in the dark with them. And nothing you know today would have made it out.